Okay. Positively addressing behaviors at home. One of the hardest things I think about being a parent, and there are so many hard things, is we, we want to raise, productive members of society. We want to raise quote unquote good humans and children that interact appropriately and everything else. And that's part of the reason that when our children don't do these things, their behavior is so frustrating to us. So that was kind of the impetus for this presentation, this webinar, and to give you some strategies that you might be able to, actually even use this evening. So psych services, as I mentioned, Amy works for psych services. I'm a consulting psychologist and behavior analyst. Psych Services is a group of school psychologists, BCBAs, licensed educational psychologists, and psychologists. And we serve families, schools, the greater Bay Area. In provide the services that we provide would be assessment, intervention, consultation, and related to consultation and some of what we're going to be talking about tonight, it would be the possibility of one-on-one sessions where we discuss your child's needs, your individual needs, and it kind of is sort of like a phone a friend kind of option where you can do little check-ins. And I tried this, it didn't work. What should I do next? So we provide all of those types of services. So when we think about reasons that our children have tantrums or why they do some of the things they do, I think we can come up with as many reasons as we have answers for why they have the tantrums. These are all from my particular children, so this is why I kind of think it's amusing. The cheese stick I wanted is gone, and it's because I ate it. So I ate it, it's gone, and now I'm going to be upset about this. My personal favorite is that my daughter loves bouncy houses. And one day we drove past the house that was being tented, and she saw the tent on the house and assumed that it was a bouncy house. And bouncy houses are one of her most favorite things in the entire world. And she was very upset to the point of tears, didn't want to go to school. I mean, it was a massive thing because she thought somebody else in the neighborhood had their house turned into a bouncy house, and I didn't do that for her. So she was quite upset about that. And I think, I mean, that's very unique to my daughter, but I think these next two, I can't get my shoes on, but I don't want any help, or my 12-month-old onesie no longer fits because I'm 3 and I dug it out of the closet. These kinds of things are probably ones that we run into on a pretty regular basis. And this is another one. I've managed to squeeze into the smallest place imaginable and I can't get out. I created this situation for myself and now I'm really frustrated and I'm unable to do anything about it, or the strategies that I'm using are not working. And then I added this in here because I think this is just pretty typical for when we're dealing with younger children, because it is a day that ends in Y. So it's just, it's any given day we can see a pretty significant tantrum. And oftentimes they're very frustrating for us. As I started by saying, part of the reason they're frustrating is we don't want our children to act this way. We want our children to be able to, articulate their needs and tell us what's upsetting them. And when they can't, it's very frustrating. And it's important for us to remember that behavior is functional and communicative. So all behavior serves a function. You may have heard that before, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a minute. But it's important to remember that it's a form of communication as well. So when our child is doing something, or when we as adults are doing something, when any of us are doing something, it serves a purpose. It's communicating something to the environment. So when you think about how hard it is to solve a problem, even if it's a simple problem, even if it's the problem that I ate my cheese stick and I don't have another one, we have to be able to recognize that something's even wrong. And if we think about this as adults, we're not always great at this. Sometimes we're having a bad day and you just kind of walk around in a funk, and it takes you halfway through the day, or for somebody to say like, what is your problem today, before we even realize that something's wrong. And so you think about young children, our children, they have to be able to say like, oh, hey, I'm having a bad moment. I'm hungry. I'm tired. My body hurts, or I'm just feeling frustrated or overstimulated or overwhelmed or whatever is going on. They have to recognize that there is something wrong. Then they have to identify the problem. Why am I feeling this way? What's going on with me? And I'll talk in a minute about the cognitive model. And I think it's erroneously assumed that younger children are not able to understand the cognitive model. And that's simply not true. We just need to talk about it using vocabulary that they can understand. But anyway, the child needs to identify the problem, and then they have to come up with a solution, and this is hard. There's a lot of adults that can't do this. And then once they come up with the solution, they have to actually implement the solution. If you think about this entire problem solving, you know, all the things that go into problem solving are super hard. This is not something that a young child or even older children are going to be able just to automatically know how to do. Most of them need to be taught this, they need modeling, they need practice. And we're going to talk about some strategies that can help with that. But again, part of the problem from the parent standpoint is we tend to react to these types of behaviors. And the reaction just comes from us wanting our children to make better choices and to make good decisions and to implement these solutions. Um, and one of the things that I find really helpful and I think is important when we're thinking about addressing behavior for anyone is we have to change our mindset. We tend to enjoy being what I call the behavior police. So we want to go around and show everyone, like, she shouldn't be doing that. He shouldn't be doing that. That's a bad decision. Why are you doing that? Don't do that anymore. We tend to focus a lot on the negative, and we don't focus on what we want the person to be doing instead. Usually, the assumption that we're making is they should know that they shouldn't be doing that. They should know they should be doing this instead. And that's not always true. So I have this cartoon, and you see Dennis the Menace in the corner, and he's saying, "Wouldn't it be easier just to tell me what I can do?" And, we might laugh at this and say that he should have known what he was supposed to do, but oftentimes children don't. Oftentimes we're not even sure. If you've ever had an argument with a friend or a spouse or a significant other or something like that, you're like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it if that'll make you happy. And we really don't know what the person wants us to do. And I saw that there was a hand raised. If you wanna go ahead, I can't unmute you, but if you have your hand raised and you wanna pop your question into the chat box, either Amy will address it or I'll pause and address it. So you can put it in the Q&A or the chat box. Um, but as I was saying, what we wanna focus on is the behaviors that we wanna see, and there's several reasons for that. But the first is that it's telling the person, "This is what I wanna see from you." That's critical because if the person is demonstrating the behavior that we want to see, we're able to provide reinforcement for that behavior. And again, I'll get to that in just a minute, but reinforcement is what keeps behavior going. That is the key to almost all of behavior management is providing consistent and frequent reinforcement. And we'll talk about what can be used as reinforcers as well during this session. Don't When I say reinforcement, I know in a lot of your minds what's probably popping up is like stuff. I have to buy them things or take them places or, whatever else, and it costs a lot of money. No, reinforcement actually can be entirely free. And, we'll talk about some ways that you can kind of manipulate the environment to really maximize the types of reinforcers that you have available. But to summarize, this idea is get out of our mind the idea of being the behavior police. We should not be focusing on what the person is doing incorrectly. We should focus on what our child is doing appropriately or what we want them to do. We want to change the language that we use, and just and shift it into those pro-social behaviors. What do I want my child to be doing? And part of this is because, as I mentioned before, behavior serves a function. Every time we engage in a behavior, we're doing it for a reason. So it might be to gain access to attention. And if you want a good example of this, just think about social media. You have people that are on your social media that post a lot, that are very active, and really the reason that they do this, and there's nothing wrong with it, the reason that they do it is in large part due to the attention that they receive. You know that when you post something, it's to share with others. It might be to get likes or more recognition. It might just be to share with family, but you're getting some kind of attention from that. Um, Another is to escape or avoid an unpleasant situation. So if you have ever faked sick to get out of work or to get out of doing something or going to a party you didn't want to do, then you have engaged in avoidant behavior. And if you've ever been somewhere and you're just like, I can't handle this anymore, I'll do anything to get out of this situation, that's escape behavior. Um, a lot of times we mistake escape or avoidant behavior as being very externalizing and potentially even very aggressive. It's not, it's just kind of this I need to get out of the situation and I don't necessarily have a better strategy to help me meet that goal. And then we have access. And a lot of little kids, especially because of their functional communication is not as developed as an older individual, it's to get access to things. I want this, it's much easier for me just to take it or to kick you or push you around or whatever else in order to get access to that. And then the fourth is sensory. All of us have minor sensory behaviors that, we get automatic reinforcement for. If you are somebody who like flicks your foot back and forth when you're sitting in a chair cross-legged or twirl your hair or anything like that, those are all considered kind of sensory behaviors. We're not gonna talk too much about that because sensory behaviors, the reinforcement comes from the person typically, and you're not able to control that. So we'll focus more on attention, escape avoidance, and access. Um, so far, what we've talked about is that tantrums are inappropriate behaviors. They all serve a function. These are the functions that are served by those inappropriate behaviors or target behaviors. And it's important for us to think about what do we want our child to do instead? What are the pro-social behaviors that we can target? You get bonus points if you're able to identify pro-social behaviors that are incompatible. That's kind of the fancy word that we use for it, that are incompatible with the target behavior or what I don't want them to be doing. So my children, as I mentioned, are 4.5 and 5. They have a lot of opinions and they like to tease each other. They like to, kind of, we call it torturing. Like, why are you torturing your brother? Why are you torturing your sister? They do things to get each other's goat. And so instead of spending a lot of time focusing on don't torture your sister or don't be mean to your brother or whatever else we would be saying, we want to think about what do I want my child to do and what do I want my child to do instead of that. And so I drew a line accidentally. And so we'll get to that in just a minute. But when we're thinking about behavior being functional, we want to think about what did my child do? Sorry, that's where the line should have gone. And how did I respond? So if my child is yelling, I don't think I can draw this very fast. If my child is yelling, I want to think about what did I do right after the child started yelling? Right after my child started yelling, did I pay a lot of attention to it? Did I allow them to get out of whatever they were doing? Did I give them access to the iPad that they were yelling for? What did I do? What was my response or what was the environmental response? And if we can think about that and think about what did my child do and then how did I respond, that's going to help us understand the communication, the functional part of what our child is doing. So I put this here because if you have a child that is consistently kind of demonstrating the same problematic behaviors that you're trying to stop, you might want to actually keep log of this, and the handouts will be mailed to you or emailed to you after the session, and so you're going to have samples of these papers to write on. You can say my child did this and what happens after. Probably one of the most frequent behaviors that I get parents asking me about is my child hits himself, he bangs his head, he bites himself, he slaps, like some kind of holds their breath. That's another big one. Um, They're minor self-injurious behaviors. If you've ever seen a kid walk over to the ground and kind of lightly tap their head on the floor, like they're trying to bang their head on the floor, they're not really trying to hurt themselves. They're just trying to get a reaction. And so all of those behaviors, the biting, all of that kind of stuff, 99% of the time, the adult response to that is attention because they're doing something that we perceive as dangerous. And I know I spend the vast majority of my time just trying to keep my kids from hurting themselves because they're constantly falling and bumping into things. And, we walk around trying to put this protective bubble around them. And so when they yell or do, or when they hurt themselves or attempt to hurt themselves, we're likely to react. The whole point in that is that attention is the adult response to that, which means that attention is the function of the behavior. Your child has learned that when they do this, they get attention for that, or they're able to escape a non preferred activity or task or environment or whatever it is. But once we identify those patterns, we're a little bit better able to prevent against them and to find a replacement behavior or what we want them to do instead. So that'll be the next thing that you'd want to identify. But I do think that it's worth mentioning. I did put this in here in terms of the cognitive model. So if you've ever taken maybe a basic psychology class or a behavior class, you've probably heard somebody say behaviorists don't care about what's in the black box, what's in your brain, or what you're thinking about. And that simply is just not true. Within the cognitive model, this is a complement to behavioral theory. It's essentially saying that our thoughts are events, they are behavior, they're just private. We're not able to see them. And so when we think about this, anytime there is an event, something happens, we automatically have thoughts about that event. We might think that was a fun event, that's a terrible event, I want to do that again, I don't want to do that again. We have all of these thoughts. We may or may not be aware of what the thoughts are. Oftentimes they happen subconsciously, but those thoughts are what actually create our feelings. It's not the event. One event, and you know this to be true because you have probably, if you do have a spouse or a significant other, you guys are probably not 100% on the same page in terms of things that you like to do. And so when you think about maybe you're really into hiking and your spouse hates to hike or your significant other hates to hike, and you're talking about going hiking, you have all these thoughts about this is going to be great. I can't wait to go. All these exciting things are going to happen. And the person that you're going to go with who doesn't like hiking is like, this is going to be terrible. It's going to be hot. It's going to, I'm going to get blisters. Whatever things that they might be thinking. And so it's the same event, it's hiking, but you both have different feelings about that particular event or that situation. And the mitigating factor is our thoughts. And the big idea here is that we can challenge our thoughts, we can think differently, we can engage in activities that could actually change our thoughts, which would help us change our feelings because our feelings drive our behavior. If you think something is terrible and it makes you feel anxious or a little angry or frustrated or just irritated that you have to do something, then you are going to be more likely to be cranky about that event and not want to participate and maybe just not even do it. And so even young children can learn the cognitive model and start to take ownership of their emotions and feelings. And how this goes with behavior is that we need to remember that a lot of the behaviors that we see sometimes are associated with a lack of vocabulary or functional communication to be able to communicate with others. And so if we can model this for our children and talk about this, it's helpful. And I have these conversations with my own children. We started when they were about 3. And it can be very simple. Like right now, I am feeling this way, and it's because these are my thoughts. These are the types of thoughts that I'm having, and this is what happens. And when during neutral times after one of my children has had a severe emotional reaction to something, we go back and we do this kind of thing, like, do you remember what you were thinking? What were you feeling? What were you doing in that particular situation, and how did you think about that? Um, so we don't want to, I mean, you're not doing full blown cognitive therapy with your child, but modeling this, modeling how you work through these things and just starting to create this vocabulary and awareness of the cognitive model in your child can really help with behavior too. Because think about how many times you've been just kind of cranky and you couldn't figure out why. And a lot of it is because you've got all these automatic thoughts going on in your head, and because you're not paying attention to them, because most of the time we walk around on autopilot, creates these feelings and these behaviors. And if we just address the thoughts, we would be able to, get rid of most of those kinds of things. So this goes hand in hand with helping to identify the function of what the behaviors are. Okay. Next, in terms of some of our just kind of background vocabulary and ideas, is reinforcement and punishment. Um, Over here, we see this is the reinforcement arrow, and here is our punishment arrow. It doesn't matter what we think about the consequence or what happens after the behavior in terms of whether it's reinforcement or punishment. What makes something a reinforcer is that it increases the future likelihood that we're going to see that behavior in the future. I know that's kind of a lot of words and it's very technical, but the takeaway message is if someone does a behavior and we or the environment respond to that behavior in a pretty consistent way, and that person's behavior continues over time, whatever we were doing or whatever the environment was doing is reinforcing that behavior. And that's really sometimes hard to kind of wrap our heads around because we think of reinforcement as having this connotation that it means it's a positive thing or it's a pleasant thing. Not necessarily. All reinforcement means is that it increases the likelihood that we're going to see that behavior in the future. So, circling back to the idea that I started with on focusing on the behaviors that we want to see, the reason that we focus on those behaviors we want to see is this right here. It's because of the reinforcement piece. If I focus on what I want my child to do instead, it gives me the opportunity to provide them with reinforcement for that behavior, to reinforce that behavior, which means I'm more likely to see the positive behavior in the future. We don't typically operate this way. We work on a punishment basis where punishment is a consequence, something that we do after we see a behavior that decreases the likelihood that we're going to see it in the future. The problem with punishment, there's a lot of problems with punishment, is that we get used to it, we satiate on it. After you're sent to the principal's office or timeout once, it kind of loses its threat or its scariness. And punishment doesn't do anything to increase the behavior that we want to see. So punishment is only good for temporarily decreasing behavior. Um, and just to talk briefly about some of the terminology a little bit, because these words oftentimes are misused in popular, writings, is all the positive means in either reinforcement or punishment, and there is such a thing as positive punishment, is that we're adding something to the environment. It just means that we're adding a consequence or stimulus. We have lots of fancy words for these. We're doing something after we see the behavior that increases the likelihood that we're going to see it in the future. Positive punishment means that we're adding something to the environment that decreases the likelihood that we're going to see the behavior in the future. The negative part of this means that we're subtracting something. So if I subtract something from the environment, I take something away after the person does the behavior and they increase or continue that behavior in the future, that's negative reinforcement. This is probably one of the most misused terms, negative reinforcement, in the field of applied behavior analysis. Negative reinforcement doesn't mean something bad. Negative reinforcement just means that I take something away and it's something I don't like or something that's aversive, and it means I'm more likely to do that behavior in the future. So if I hate doing laundry, if my husband told me, if you take the kids to school every day this week and you pick them up, I'll do all the laundry for the next 2 weeks, I would certainly do that. And that's an example of negative reinforcement. It's taking away the negative, the aversive thing of doing laundry that I don't like to do. Um, Negative punishment is taking away something that someone likes or enjoys or wants or whatever, and it decreases the likelihood that they're going to do the behavior in the future. A lot of times we try and use punishment in terms of like taking away privileges, taking away toys, taking away, your freedom if your child's on restriction or something like that. And we think that negative punishment is going to kind of fix the problem. Punishment, oftentimes, if we are overly punitive, it just creates a behavioral vacuum. It creates this situation where we just don't do anything because we don't want to get in trouble, but it doesn't mean that we're doing the pro-social behaviors. So the takeaway from this is that punishment has its place. I'm not saying we should never punish our children. I punish my children. We do have timeout. We have, they're restricted from access to reinforcement on certain occasions. It's definitely something necessary that we need to have in our toolbox. But punishment is not going to achieve our ultimate goal of getting our children or anyone, this works with anyone, to demonstrate high rates of behavior. Instead, I just walk around trying to stay out of trouble. Reinforcement is what we need to do if we want to increase or see more behaviors that we would like to see in our children. And so that again goes back to this idea of stepping away from being the behavior police a little bit more and focusing instead on what we want our child to do and having the opportunity to provide reinforcement for those behaviors. And both positive and negative reinforcement will work. You can think about your child getting out of chores and things like that. And we'll talk about some more concrete examples in just a minute. But remember, reinforcement is the only thing that's going to increase behavior. And if you have a behavior that you don't like and you see it on a continual basis, what that means is that behavior is being reinforced. That behavior is being reinforced, even if what we think we're doing is punishing or unpleasant or whatever else. If we continue to see it, it must be followed with reinforcement. So if you think, kind of putting all of this together, you have your what do they do? What do I do? And then what are the consequences that are keeping this behavior going? Whatever I'm doing or whatever the environment is doing is providing reinforcement for those behaviors. So it's a little bit of background. Now we need to think about how do we, move from surviving to thriving. So it's this idea like, I don't want to just kind of white knuckle it through my day. And, I want to enjoy my children. And I say that very tongue in cheek because there's certainly days where I'm like, I would just like to sit in a dark room with a glass of wine and have no sound or anything going on around me because of all of the stimulus that we typically have when we're raising children. But we want to move from just trying to like get through the day to reducing some of those power struggles and some of the things that you might be struggling with. So what do our children do? They have emotional reactions. They hit, bite, scratch, throw things, all of these kinds of tantrums. They're also adorable and sweet, which is why we keep them, because they do all these things and then they smile and tell us they love them and are very cute. And so, that works in their favor. But all joking aside, what can we do? We need to remain calm. And yes, I understand that's easier said than done. We need to control our behavior after their behavior, because remember, it's our behavior and our response to their behavior that's either reinforcing or punishing. So it's really one of the hardest things about getting someone else to change their behavior is understanding that it's about our behavioral change, that the reinforcement and the punishment that we provide is what shapes the future behavior that we see. And so we need to control our behavior. Now, that is very hard to do. Remaining calm and controlling our behavior is not an easy task, especially again when it's your child. However, it's a heck of a lot easier to prevent problem behaviors. And so we'll talk about strategies that you can use to just keep the problem behavior from even occurring. And the real key to this is reinforcing during the calm phase. and we'll get to that. So, how do you remain calm during a tantrum? This is super frustrating. It's really hard. Um, I definitely have caught myself reacting to one of my children throwing a tantrum, and it's like I'm in my head going, "You know better. You know this is not the right response to this particular problem, and yet you still do it because we're human." But to the greatest extent, we want to ignore it. We want to walk away. We do want to focus on safety, so we don't want them hurting themselves or others, and then practice self care. You might need 5 minutes in the bathroom by yourself. You might need a minute to just go stand outside and breathe some fresh air and take a minute. Um, but to the greatest extent possible, we want to remain calm. We want to not react emotionally because that's when we start making not the best decisions in terms of our own behavior. We really want to refrain from reacting or giving in. And the problem with this is that if during a tantrum, if we give in mid tantrum, we're actually making the problem worse. And you may have seen this in your own children or in somebody, friend's children or something like that. Here's what happens. It's called an extinction burst. Here's the problem behavior. It's kind of like this is the level that it's at. Well, once you start ignoring it and you walk away, you're going to see a temporary increase in behavior. And that's essentially like, this has gotten me what I wanted in the past. You took away my ability to get that. And so now I'm going to increase. I'm going to do it louder, harder, faster, whatever. And we typically, the human response is just to react to that, to give in and say, like, okay, here, just be quiet. Like, you can get whatever this is. But the problem is the next time your child wants whatever that is, they're going to start with their behavior up here at the top because they learned through that exchange that this level of behavior doesn't work anymore. That's not successful. So next time I need to start right up here. And it strengthens and increases the behavior over time. So we really want to, work to not react or give in. And this next comment I understand comes from a place of potential privilege, but if you are lucky, enough, or you have a spouse, or some another adult in the house that is helping you with childcare and raising your children, it's really good to establish a tag team system. Um, my husband and I have kind of code that we use, like when we notice that the other one is getting kind of worked up, you know, interacting with the children, and it's like we tap in and tap out. And it's just like, you need to go outside, you need to ignore it, you need to walk away because we don't want to help reinforce this behavior and we don't want to escalate it or make it any worse. And so if you have that opportunity or you have access to that in your house, try and develop your own tag team system where you can see, like, okay, I'm getting a little hot. I need to go practice some self care and walk away from this situation. This is an example. It's from an older child, but I think you can kind of think about maybe with technology, your own child or something like that, how this escalation occurs. So the parent asks the child to stop playing on the computer, the child screams, parent tells them again, it goes on and on and on. There starts to get some threatening, like he's going to lose computer privileges. I'm going to take your Kindle away. I'm going to take your iPad away, whatever it is. They continue to argue, and then the parent becomes angry and leaves the room. The child continues to be able to have access to their device. The other option would be trying to physically remove it, which can, result in a physical altercation and things like that. So we don't want to engage in these kinds of power struggles. Because it rarely works. It ends up with our behavior and our emotions being escalated. It creates an emotional response in our children, and we typically don't resolve it in a way we don't get the result that we wanted anyway. So, when we think about what we would like our children to do instead, like I mentioned before, we want to the greatest extent possible to focus on incompatible behaviors. So the target behavior is what they're doing now. The replacement behavior would be what I want them to do instead. So the example that I was using earlier with my children, where they tease each other, torture each other, give each other a hard time. The replacement behavior for that would be say something kind, do something kind, help your sister, read a book to your sister, those kinds of things. Like choose something better because you can't be being nice and teasing her at the same time. So it's not always possible to identify an incompatible behavior, but a lot of the time it is, and it's really beneficial if we're able to do that. So, over the next couple of days, just kind of watch your children. And here's where you get to be the behavior police. You do get to identify, like, oh, I wish they wouldn't do that. That's really annoying when they do that. Like, kind of be a little critical, obviously, to yourself about what they're doing. And then at the same time, though, say, what in this very moment, what would I like them to be doing instead? What would be the replacement behavior? What would be the key thing that I would be looking for? And then you can start to think about, like, why does my child keep doing that? What is the function, the potential function of that behavior? Am I paying attention to it? Are they getting access to what they want? What's going on? And so once you put both of those pieces together, it allows you to address the behaviors a little bit more efficiently. Um, and so once we identify those replacement behaviors, we can start reinforcing those behaviors. We can provide more positive or negative reinforcement when our children demonstrate those behaviors. And remember, reinforcement is what keeps behavior going. So we have kind of this big circle now of thinking about the function, why they're doing it, what do we want them to do instead, and the next part is how are we going to provide reinforcement to them? And so we'll get to that in just a minute. But preventing problem behaviors, that's another key piece of that is reinforcing during calm times. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Offer choices. We like to call it the illusion of control. So when you offer someone, when you tell them they can choose, one thing or another, it gives them the feeling that, oh, I'm in control of this situation. And if you've met a young child lately, that part of their whole thing is I'm trying to figure out what I can control. Like I'm developing my autonomy. And we see it kick up again in, middle school, early teenage years. Like I want to know what I can control about my life. Distractions are great too. Like, hey, look over here, do this instead. Not to be confused with the next suggestion, which is to limit distractions and access to problematic items. Those are distractions that we don't want the children to have that can cause overstimulation. And then lastly, and I'm really guilty of this too as a parent, be sensitive to times when behaviors are more likely to occur. They're tired, they're hungry, they're overstimulated. We're kind of a go hard sort of family. And so it's like, let's just keep going. Like, let's push a little bit further. And you have to at some point just be like, our kids are tired and we know they're going to start melting down. And it's not really their fault because we know that this is likely going to happen. So maybe we shouldn't, have kept them out as late or done whatever we were going to do. Okay, this is the typical phases of acting out. So we see calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, and then as we start to de-escalate. Key thing about this is during the calm phase, this is when we typically ignore our children. And this happens with any type of behavior. If you're at work and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, most of the time you get ignored. No, people don't usually walk by and be like, oh, hey, great job working. That doesn't happen. We ignore it. The only time you hear from anybody is when you've done something wrong. But the idea is we typically ignore during the calm phase. Well, ignoring is a type of punishment. So when we ignore, we're less likely to see that behavior continue or maintain. This is the time when we want to provide a lot of reinforcement. So I know sometimes I hear my children playing nicely and I'm like, ooh, I don't want to say anything because I don't want them to remember that I'm even here because we have this calm phase. But actually, we want to do the opposite. We want to provide reinforcement. We want to provide feedback and say, like, I love the way you guys are playing so nicely together. Like, I really like how you're sharing your toys or whatever it is, because that's actually more likely to prolong the calm phase. We also, once we get into the trigger, the agitation, and the acceleration phase, that's where we want to walk away. That's part of that escalation cycle. And if you think about it, if you've ever been really upset and someone tells you you should just calm down, You never calm down. That doesn't work. You usually want to kick them because you're already in this emotional kind of state and somebody's telling you like you should just get over it. So we want to think about that with our children too. Like when they're truly melting down, that's not the time to introduce the cognitive model. That's not the time to start talking about our feelings and our emotions and everything else. That's the time to ride it out. And then after recovery, back here on the backside, that's where we can start to maybe have some teachable moments and talk about what we would have done instead. Okay, and then types of reinforcers. This is another thing that you and your children and your family can really think about is that reinforcers, when we think about those, we want to think about all those different functions. So, attention, escape avoidance, tangibles, activities, those kinds of things. So the earn column is the tangibles. That's the stuff that costs money, stickers, gift cards, tokens, those kinds of things. But all these different activities and social types of things, you really can maximize on those, especially with little kids because they're not able to orchestrate a lot of this kind of stuff. You have control with that. And so you can make it contingent on their behavior. And then here's the escape avoidance. This is the negative reinforcement column. Things I would like to not do: clean my room, go to X, I just put wherever, pick up my toys, take a bath. I mean, not taking a bath one night is not going to kill your children. And that might be something that they would really work for because they can get out of doing something they don't like to do. I, a little bit more, I think a lot of us, we have really kind of quote unquote spoiled our children and they have access to a lot of these things. And one of the things we can do is think about all of the privileges and the things that our children have, and we can actually take those away and make those things part of their reinforcement menu. There's nothing wrong with starting very early and getting our children to understand if you want access to the park, if you want access to, going to the zoo or whatever else, or a restaurant or things like that, you have to earn that. And that's an important life lesson. I mean, we understand that as adults. It's something that, we have to contend with on a daily basis. But my point in saying that is when you think about like what can we use as reinforcers in our home for our children's behavior, think about what do we already have and what can we temporarily take away and make them earn. um, and it can be something as simple as I put my clothes in the dirty clothes hamper, at the end of the night, and that helps me earn access to a privilege or an activity that I would like to do. And so really, really think about those and kind of be critical, of the things that your children already have access to. So this is another kind of worksheet that will be in the handout that's mailed to you, but write down all the activities that your kids like to do, things that they would like to earn, social, what they would like to not do. And so make your own reinforcement menu for your home. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. In my house, it's a magnetic whiteboard and we take pictures and put magnets on the back of them, and it's just different things that they can earn, and they earn, I mean, it's fake money, but it's money for demonstrating appropriate behaviors. And it's not necessarily an allowance or anything like that. It's just understanding you're a member of this family, you're contributing, these are the things that we want to see. A pro tip, and you don't have to do this, but you can also create like a cost system associated with those different activities. So maybe, going to a theme park is far more expensive than just going to the neighborhood park. I use this picture because anytime you go to, like a Dave and Buster's or Chuck E. Cheese or anything like that, they have the top shelf prizes and, the lower shelf prizes. So one of the reasons that we like to, in our reinforcement menu, have things that run this gamut is some kids and some humans and some adults and everything else, they're spenders, they want to get rid of it right away, and other people like to save. And so you might have a child who's like, no, I want to save up for that theme park, I'm willing to, really work towards that goal. And then you might have a child that's like, no, I don't care that much, I just want to go to the park every day. So I'm going to work towards, my 5 tokens or whatever it is to get to that. So you can take this reinforcement menu and actually put price values. I usually in families that I'm working with, I just suggest you do like a low cost, medium cost, and a high cost. And maybe it's like $5, $2, or $1. Make it easy on yourself. Um, but again, you don't need to do this for a reinforcement system to work. It's just a nice way to kind of even further kind of expand the reinforcement options that you have available. With reinforcement can be verbal. Verbal reinforcement in the form of attention is just fine. Those other things that I was talking about in terms of reinforcement are done to help fill in the different gaps associated with the function of our behavior. So if you don't have a child that's super motivated by access to attention, giving them positive verbal praise isn't going to get you that far. It might be the fact that they do like to get out of things. They like to be by themselves. They want to sit, in their room and play quietly by themselves, especially if you have more than one child. I know my children will work for quiet time alone in their room where their siblings not allowed to come in because it's their private time. Um, but when you're providing reinforcement, you want to make sure you're sincere, no sarcasm, and only focus on the current behavior. We're not focusing on 4 minutes ago. We're not focusing on how maybe you've just kind of been terrible all day. We're focusing on the here and now. We want to provide feedback immediately after you see the behavior. And like I said, if you're providing a token or other tangible reinforcer, that should also be provided immediately. You want to identify the desired behavior. So I really like the way you did this. And we want to avoid the negative reinforcement trap. And I'll talk about that in just a second. This is probably the biggest key to reinforcement in the home, and it's one of the harder things to establish, is that something can only be used as a reinforcer if you can restrict access to it. So if you're using technology as a reinforcer, something that's on the menu, but your child has access, like kind of free access to technology, it's not locked up, it's not kept out of reach when they haven't earned it, you can't use that as a reinforcer. So basically, all the stuff that they have free access to kind of has to be off the table in terms of reinforcement. And it's just because we have to be able to restrict access to it. If you think about, as adults, we're really terrible at self reinforcing. And the reason is, you might say, okay, I'm going to wait to eat that piece of candy until I get my work done. Well, chances are you're going to cheat. You're not going to get your work done. You're like, okay, well, I'm just going to take a break and I'm going to go eat that piece of candy or whatever it is. Kids will do the same thing. So we need to make sure that we're restricting access. The negative reinforcement trap. So I just talked to you about how negative reinforcement can be used appropriately, and it can be a powerful tool, but it can also backfire. And so here is a perfect example. So that you see the child in bed and she's like, this is great. And she's like, I'll have to wake up crying in the middle of the night more often. Well, the reason that the parents brought the child to bed, and I was guilty of this, both of my children, like, when they would cry, we'd let them come into bed with us because I needed sleep. And so it's this idea, the parents, there's this aversive stimuli, your child crying, and you want it to stop. And what'll get it to stop is bringing your child to bed with you. And so you have now been negatively reinforced, whereas the child has been positively reinforced. And the problem behind this is that you, I just saw somebody put in the chat a Wi-Fi password. That is an excellent example of how you can restrict access to reinforcement. Absolutely, 100%. That was a great example. So I agree with Amy. But the cautions of negative reinforcement is that you can kind of get into this nagging sort of cycle where I nag at you, nag at you, nag at you, and then you finally do it. And so it's like the only reason you did it was because I was nagging at you and you wanted me to stop. And so we don't want to get into the habit of that kind of coercive cycle. When we're using negative reinforcement, it should be spelled out right from the beginning. Like, you can earn your way out of this. Even if you have older children and they don't want to go to some party with, your younger children's friends, or they don't want to do something like that, let them earn their way out of it. That's an example of how negative reinforcement can be used in a more, I guess, proactive way.
Kat, we have a question.
Yeah.
Is now an okay time for me to read it?
Sure.
Okay. The question is, do you have tips on encouraging behaviors that we'd like to see that are a life skill, like using the potty? Is
Yeah, I just
reinforcement a recommended approach, especially for a potty resistant preschooler?
potty training. The first thing with potty training is you need to make sure that developmentally they're ready. Um, so they need to, and the reason I say that is because honestly, it's not completely out of the norm from a biological standpoint for kids to still like sometimes have accidents well into kindergarten, first grade, especially at night. So you want to rule out any kind of medical condition. You want to make sure that developmentally they're ready for that particular task. But yes, you can certainly build reinforcement once you've identified that. It's like you set you set the situation up. And so if you've read potty training books, a lot of times they'll say give your child a lot of liquids and then within about 20 or 30 minutes, set them on the potty, let them go. As soon as they do that, provide them with reinforcement. Um, so that's a perfectly like acceptable way to use these same types of skills with potty training. Um, you can also some of those reinforcers, I mean, it's not uncommon to choose, let them choose particular underwear or some with my son, I will just so these are the 2 things that I used with my children. My son was a little bit easier to potty train. He loves animals, and so we got him all these different types of animals, and he could earn an animal after he'd gone on the potty after so many days and hadn't had an accident. My daughter wanted to earn princess dresses. The only way we could get her to go to the bathroom because she would have been perfectly fine having us change her diapers probably well into high school. She would have been fine with it. She didn't care. I think she thought it was funny. And so basically she had princess dresses. We restricted access to those princess dresses and she would only earn them if she was successful in going on the potty. Um, but again, you want to make sure that they are physically able to do that. And you want to try and refrain as much from, quote unquote, punishing a real accident, just understanding that accidents are going to happen. So you want to focus more on reinforcing the replacement behavior, the incompatible behavior, which is going to the bathroom. So that was a really great question. If you have a follow-up question to that, please feel free to put it back in Q&A and I will, we can talk more about that. Um, this slide is just offer choices. So I really like this example. Your child has to wear a shirt. And so, I mean, your end goal is that they have to wear a shirt, but their option is to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt. It's the illusion of choice. They feel like, the illusion of control, like they're in control. Well, no, you wanted them to wear a shirt. You just didn't really care if it was the red or the blue one, and they're able to exert some choice into that. Um, and then what I sort of contradicting that, but what it means is that when we're thinking about limiting choices, like in distractions and overwhelming them, understanding that children can get like overstimulated and there's too much. And so when we're talking about choices, we usually want to limit it to like 2 or maybe 3 things and then not go much further than that. And then last, this is the point that I want to hit, and then we'll open it back up to questions, the sensitivity to internal states. So right here, we have what we call satiation. Right here, we have what we call deprivation. Anytime someone is in a deprived state, so they're hungry or they're tired, they're more likely to demonstrate behaviors that will get them access to food or a nap, or, those are just 2 examples. When we are satiated, we are less likely to engage in whatever behavior typically gets us the thing that has satiated us. So here's an example. I have not eaten dinner yet today. I'm starting to get hungry. So after this webinar, I'm going to engage in behavior that gets me access to dinner. If I had eaten before the webinar and I was not hungry, I would be less likely to engage in behavior that would get me access to food because I was already satiated. So one of the most powerful things we can do also to help prevent against problem behaviors is keep our kids satiated. So I even prior to the pandemic, I worked from home a lot of the time, and that's always been hard for my children, having kind of that separation of home and work. And I'm still not doing a great job of managing it, but I think most of us can appreciate that. I know that as soon as I open up my computer, my kids suddenly want my attention. It's like, "Mom, mom, mom," and anyway, they're doing all these kinds of things, and you're like, you're just doing it to get attention. So now, and I'm not perfect, I don't do it every time, but what I really try and make a concerted effort to do is when I know I'm going to have to go take a work call, or I know I'm going to have to do something work related and I need them to be quiet, I will sit and snuggle with them and hug them and read them a story and give them kind of a lot of attention. So satiate them with my attention, and then they're less likely to demonstrate in those kinds of behaviors that are attention seeking, when I don't want them to be. So if you can flood the environment with reinforcement, whatever it is that kind of makes your kid tick prior to when you know a problem behavior might occur, like you have to take a Zoom call or you want to talk to your friend or whatever it is, then you might want to consider flooding the environment with satiation. So I'm going to stop sharing. We have a few minutes left. So thank you again for attending. I appreciate you all coming. The princess dress example. Yeah, so I strongly recommend that method if she's into princess dresses. And again, it sounds potentially mean because she already had the princess dresses and we just took them away and we said you can earn one every time you have a bowel movement. That's where we were at. She was stuck on that. And it took a couple weeks, but then eventually she's like, I really want to wear my Rapunzel dress to school. And it was like, well, you know what you need to do to get that Rapunzel dress. And she did. She wore princess dresses to school exclusively for the better part of a year when she was potty training. So, all right. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Amy, do you want to tell me about the survey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm about to put a link into the chat, and you can fill it out to be entered for a door prize. So there's a door prize of a Target gift card, and then there's also one of an hour of free consultation through our pocket coaching service. So I'll put that in the chat right now.
Okay. Um, so Tina just asked a question about black pants. My suggestion, which is probably not one that you want to have, is that the hill you want to die on? Um, I probably would just say you can wear black pants. Like it's pretty typical for kids to focus on like what might seem like really weird sort of clothing options. And it's hard to get them off of that. A lot of that is just they're developmentally trying to, maintain control over things. If it's an event or something you're going to where you can't wear black pants, again, I would front load it and use that kind of those satiation practices and just let him wear all the black pants and tell him at the end of the night or whenever we go out, you're going to have to wear these pants or these pants and they're not black pants. And so but clothing is a hard one because there's definitely usually a little more to it in terms of their control. And thanks everybody for coming.